And so we are moving right along here in Rudolf Steiner's Egyptian Myths and Mysteries, and this is lecture number 7, which is subtitled Evolutionary Events in the Human Organism Up to the Departure of the Moon, Osiris and Isis as Builders of the Upper Human Form. And this lecture was given on September 9th, 1908. This is a rather bizarre account here. Everything in Steiner is always a little weird, but I like that about him. That's why I like him, because he is so weird. And what he tries to do in this account is to rewind back over his myth of evolution again. And it is just a myth, I'm quite certain of that, although it's a kind of interesting dream version, like I said a couple of talks ago, of our scientific version of our creation myths, as though one were dreaming that scientific narrative into pictorial mythological language. And what he does this time is he tries to connect it to the precession of the equinoxes back through the zodiac, although this, as he says, would be processions of precessional cycles. Each one lasts 25,920 years for a complete precession. And this would have been many, many of those going way, way back. And so he says, first he recounts the myth of Osiris that I recounted last time, so we don't need to go back over that. So he recounts that myth, and he says, now this, what I'm going to tell you, is what the Egyptian initiate, as he was being initiated by his, or the Egyptian neophyte, would be seen clairvoyantly as the initiate, the master, was initiating him. These are the kinds of events that he would be seeing clairvoyantly. And he says that, remember how when we first started, so go back to the beginning when we started with the earth, once again as this primeval mist with these little human light germs. He describes them a little better. He says that they would have looked something like these chalice-shaped vessels of light with a kind of corolla, an almost plant-shaped corolla that is open. And they would have looked like sort of like fireflies flitting about. If you could imagine fireflies flitting about, that is what they would have looked like. And then gradually over time, this is the Earth phase now, sort of recapitulating the previous phases of Saturn, Sun, and Moon. They would have developed a sort of dense gaseous air cloud around them, as of course this would correspond to his elemental shift from warmth and fire to air on the Sun phase. And the Sun has not differentiated yet from Earth plus Moon, so it's still at this point one single body. But air begins to densify and forms a sort of gaseous envelope around these beings who are still flitting around. And then eventually, of course, once the Sun had separated from the Earth, then water forms. So we get this model of a watery Earth that gradually pulls these human light vessels that are flitting about like moths in the previous phase, pulls them down into it, so that, as we said before, the human is half submerged in the water, and the top half is this light-filled corolla that is turned heliocentrically, like a plant turns toward the Sun. So in a certain way, these are sort of like, he calls them flower men. These are like plant humans, and they dip down into the water. And meanwhile, so the human beings are there first, and then meanwhile, the germs of what will later become the animals are starting to appear in these waters. So once the Sun has withdrawn, we get the first appearance of animal forms as these little animal beings that begin to evolve and develop, and they get to the level of fish. He says they don't look anything like today's fish, but they would have reached an equivalent level, so that the human beings are undergoing transformations while these animal beings are undergoing transformations, and they evolve to the level of fish that are swimming about in these waters. And most of the fish beings actually remain fish beings. They just stay that way all through evolution. But lots of other animal forms then begin to combine with the human form. So we begin to get animal-human hybrids, just as in the history of our mythology. And I think in a certain way that's what he's doing here, is he's sort of recapping the history of our mythologies, in which the gods started as animals, and then eventually in the Paleolithic, and then eventually our Egyptian gods are sort of half animal, half human. Most Egyptian gods have animal heads at one point or another, or animal parts to their bodies. And then with the Greeks, by the time we get to the Greeks, those animal-headed gods are gone for the most part, but we do still have centaurs that are half animal, half human, and minotaurs, which now are monstrosities with a human body and the head of a bull, is now a monster, but that monster would have been one of the gods in the Egyptian periods, so it gets demoted as the human begins to extract itself astrally from entanglement with theriomorphic or zoological animal forms. As our mythological consciousness structures have evolved over time, our gods have become more and more human, until with the Christian pantheon, of course, they're purely human. So he says that the human begins to absorb in the lower half of his body these animal forms, which are, the lower half becomes fish-like, and the upper half still remains like this light being, this being of light that's floating around the top half, and the bottom half is flipping around. And then it continues to evolve or devolve, depending on how you want to look at it, into almost like an amphibian half in the bottom half. And he says that the top part of it would have gradually, over time, will withdraw and shrink, and eventually it just becomes this sort of lantern of lights hanging out on a stalk that the human being is able to light his way through in the darkness as he's going along, which reminds me of an anglerfish. And I'm pretty sure Steiner would have known about anglerfish. They were first found in 1891, and they date back all the way to the Cretaceous. Their ancestors do, the middle of the Cretaceous, about 130 million years ago, although they flourish in the Eocene, which is about 55 million years ago, which is the epoch right after the dinosaurs, and they've been alive ever since. And those are those monstrous bulbous creatures with wide open mouths with lots of scary looking teeth, and then they have a stalk that hangs out with a bioluminescent end, and that bioluminescent end is used as bait. The fish see it in the darkness and they swim toward it, and they see what looks like a juicy looking worm hanging on the end of it below the light bulb thing, and they go after it, and of course the anglerfish gobbles them up. I learned that it's interesting looking up anglerfish that the light at the end of that stalk is actually made by bacteria that are in symbiosis with the anglerfish, and the bacteria luminesce, but that these rod-shaped bacteria, they don't have flagellae or anything like that. They're locked in place. These bacteria cannot luminesce on their own without certain chemicals given to them by the anglerfish, which is really interesting. That's symbiotic relationship between these bioluminescent bacteria and the anglerfish. And that stalk appears right in the middle of the forehead of this creature, which says in the article I read that it's a transformed fin, a type of fin, but it looks to me like it's right in the spot where the pineal gland would go. And indeed, Steiner says that this organ that these primordial humans are using to light their way in the dark later will shrink down and become the pineal gland. And also consider in mind, too, that the pineal gland is about in the same spot, if not exactly the same, as the Agya chakra in Kundalini Yoga, which is a two-petaled lotus. And Steiner has described these beings' upper halves as flower-shaped, that gradually withdraws. Maybe they lose their petals and go all the way down to the two petals of the Agya chakra, which is the beholding of the eye of vision, the beatific vision, or just the gods, the realm of the gods that is beheld by the yogic initiate when the Kundalini has awakened the Agya chakra. So these creatures are swimming about, and they've fused with other animals so that these creatures are half animal, half human. And then, of course, the moon withdraws. So the earth goes through that trauma with the withdrawal of the moon. And as the moon withdraws, then the solids begin to form, and islands slowly begin to thrust up out of this primordial ocean. They begin to thrust up, and the human being, he says, the fish forms first appeared under the sign of the precession when it was in the sign of Pisces. Although this would have been many, many cycles of 25,000 years ago, many of them. So at some dim point, when the precession was in Pisces. This is why we call it Pisces, he says, because at this point the human being was fish-like, and there were fish swimming around in the water. And this was also the waterman. So at a certain point, it becomes analogous to the waterman, Aquarius, which processes one sign backwards. And then he says, strangely, at one point, this creature transforms into something that could be called like a goat, which I find hard to understand how the upper half of this being, I understand the lower part being fish-like, but these are humans, and the upper half is supposed to be this light being with a corolla that's shrinking into just a stalk, like the anglerfish's stalk with the light, bioluminescent light on the end of it. And how that could resemble a goat's, I'm not quite sure. The only way I could resolve it would be by suggesting that, and it's kind of forcing it a bit, that the goatfish is half animal, half aquatic, and so are amphibians. Amphibians can live half on the land and half in the water. So maybe in that sense, because he says that humans are now climbing up out of the water, getting onto some of these islands where they remain in this state of half human, half animal, sort of crawling around. So I guess they would be analogous to the goatfish in that sense. But then he says even more puzzlingly, as we process backward from Capricorn to the Archer, Sagittarius, that the human form now begins to take on the form of a centaur. But he says, but not the literal form of a horse, but just that the horse signifies an animal, the animal kingdom generally, so that whatever centaur formation is upwardly human and downwardly animal, he doesn't explain, but that's what these creatures are now that have climbed up out of the water. And so in a weird way, he gives this sort of astral version of the myth of evolution, of the transformation from fishes to amphibians that are crawling up out of the water onto the land. Only this is the astral version, not the Darwinian version of it. So he can do whatever he wants. I guess this is myth making. It's not not physical reality. So these creatures are up on the land, and then he says, recall that I'd said that when the moon withdrew, together with Osiris along with it, at that point, earlier on, these creatures had begun to breathe the air, and they had to die. And he says that now at this point, though, once they're on the land, they invent sexual reproduction. And this is now the sign of Scorpio, since he says Scorpio is associated with sexuality. Scorpios, I guess, are known for their sexual appetites. I don't know. It doesn't seem to be that way. I've known many quite sexual people who are not Scorpios, so I'm not sure about that. But anyways, that's the tradition of the sign. That's as far back as he gets in terms of these processions. It's a little hard for me to believe, though, that each of these epochs that he's talking about here would take place over only 2,000 years, or 2,100 at most, right? 2,200 if we want to cut more slack. This must have been going on over eons, millions of years. So I'm not sure why. But anyways, he likes connecting it with the zodiac, like we saw that he connected his historical model with the precession of the zodiac with the ancient Indian that was totally fictional between 7,000 and 5,000, and the ancient Persian that was also totally fictional between 5,000 and 3,000 BC, but he likes the symbolism of them matching the signs of the zodiac. The crab with the Indian disappearing, leaving his exoskeletal body behind during yoga, and with the twins with the Gemini and Zoroastrian dualism. He likes the symbol. He likes connecting the symbols. He doesn't care much about archaeological evidence or concrete reality. So you just have to read him for the poetry of his ideas. It's like I said, it's like reading Tolkien or H.P. Lovecraft or something. So that's as far back as he gets with this, with these human animal type beings crawling around on these islands now. But then he says, so all this is what the Egyptian neophyte would have been perceiving as his initiate master, the one who has been initiated into the mysteries, would have been showing him clairvoyantly in these trance states, I suppose. And he says that the Greeks had lost this ability. And he says that the Egyptians made fun of them for this, quoting the opening lines of Plato's Timaeus, where Solon is making fun of the Egyptians for being eternally youthful. That's the archetype of the wonder child, by the way, for being eternally youthful. And there's not an old man among you. Meaning there's no regard for any kind of hoary old age or traditions that are older than the Greek traditions. You Greeks just remain in the state of children. And then he says that But what's interesting with respect to the Greeks now and Osiris is that when the Greeks perceived Osiris, they equated him with Apollo, which I find doesn't fit very well. And I'm not sure what tradition he's drawing from here, because Apollo is a sun god, as is well known. But it was originally thought by anthropologists that Osiris was a sun god. He is not, as we have seen. He is a moon god thoroughly. But that may have been the original basis for the comparison, if there ever was such a comparison, which I strongly doubt. I think Apollo would have been equated with Re, the sun god, not with Osiris. Osiris would have been equated with somebody more like Dionysus, let's say, just as Alain Danielou wrote a book called Shiva and Dionysus, where he equated the Shiva cults of India with the Dionysus cults. And I would have to say that Osiris would be another, a middle, in between the two traditions, the middle equivalent. But he says that with regard to our esoteric anatomy, where we said that when the moon withdrew and the Osirian moon energy began to pour down on the human being, he says that by this point in human evolution, rewinding back a bit to the creatures on the islands and so forth, that the light half had slowly withdrawn, and as the corolla-shaped light half slowly withdrew and shrank down, it gradually condensed and solidified into the human brain. And then under the moon forces from Osiris, the spinal column would have formed with its 28 pairs of nerve endings. So notice that. That's interesting that the brain has come into being as condensed light from the sun, from this light part of the human being's upper half, heliocentrically turned toward the sun, and its lower half with the spinal column forming under the influence of the moon. That's pretty interesting, actually. And then with the 28 pairs of nerve endings, he said that's a little bit like, you could put it like these are the arms or the hands of Osiris, 28 pairs of arms with hands playing the nerves that lead to the brain and the nervous system, exactly the way with Apollo he would play on the strings of his harp, so that the harp would be analogous to the brain and the strings would be analogous to the 28 pairs of nerves that we talked about previously that would have been built up from these moon, Osirian, and Isis forces together, the 14 upper being Osiris and the 14 lower, I guess, being associated with Isis, determining the sexuality of the individual. And so that's where Steiner ends this chapter, which is a bit shorter than the others, lecture number 7. So we'll pause there with the synopsis of that chapter of Steiner's Egyptian Myth and Mysteries.